She's loading the slides. I'll just get started. But I'm going to be talking about livelihood interventions, and one of the reasons that Elvin asked me to talk about this today is to Diane's point earlier, thinking about one intervention that could have multiple impacts beyond HIV. So let me just start with a definition. According to UNDP, a livelihood is the capabilities, assets, and activities required for means of living. And according to DFID's Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, there are 5 categories of assets that can be impacted by livelihood interventions, and these are human capital, social capital, natural capital, physical, and financial capital. So there are many examples of livelihood interventions that can bolster these forms of capital and associated skills. For example, if you want to bolster, for instance, human capital by advancing skills and knowledge, you may consider something like computer or financial literacy, education, or other forms of educational attainment. But there are a number of threats that could attenuate the impacts of livelihood interventions, and we really need to pay attention to those. At the end, I will describe how this played out in one of our studies in Kenya. So when understanding how livelihoods can impact health, a key point I want to make is that livelihoods are addressing some of the root causes of poor health, such as food insecurity and poverty, and as such, can impact multiple health outcomes simultaneously. So you really need to think of this as a horizontal approach that can affect many different vertical health targets. So looking at this model, we see that food insecurity and poverty are root causes of poor health, and these are significantly impacted by climate change in many settings. And livelihood interventions can help improve these root causes, leading then to improved empowerment, mental health, health behaviors, and nutrition. And this then can affect a number of health outcomes such as HIV and reproductive health, early childhood development and child health, and obesity and cardiovascular disease. So in 2016, Mandy Swan from FHI 360, along with the support of PEPFAR and USAID, conducted an in-depth review of the literature on household economic strengthening interventions. And there were 12 categories of interventions looked at with respect to HIV outcomes, most of them on adherence and viral suppression. But the key point I want to make here is if you look specifically at those interventions that could be thought of in the category of livelihood interventions, you can see there's really very few studies in each of these categories, most having only 1 or 2 studies. And then if you look at the one that had 6 studies, so income generation, you could see that the data were really of medium quality. They were generally small studies. Most of them had looked at combined effects of income generation with another type of intervention. And within this context, the evidence on impacts on adherence and viral suppression was quite mixed. So clearly there is a need for more data. So that brings me to our team who tried to address the gap in the literature by conducting a livelihood intervention, along with my co-principal investigators Craig Cohen and Elizabeth Bakusi from Kemri, that we call Shamba Maisha, which means farming for life in Kiswahili. The goal here was to try to target some of the root causes of poverty and food insecurity in the region, which in this case was inconsistent rainfall and increasing frequency of drought, particularly in the setting of climate change. And we thought that this had the potential to impact financial, human, natural, and social capital. So we tested this in 2 clusters initially in the R34 stage of 140 people, and are currently now in the 4th year of our R01, which I'll get to. The intervention had 3 components: a microfinance loan to purchase a human-powered water pump, as well as other farming implements, the water pump itself, and education in sustainable farming practices, as well as financial management. And here's our framework building upon the livelihood framework that I showed you earlier, where we had hypothesized that this multi-sectoral intervention would first improve food security and household wealth, and then through a number of pathways would lead to decreased HIV morbidity and mortality. And those pathways are improved nutrition, better ART adherence and retention in care, improved mental health, and enhanced empowerment. And I'll briefly go through our results from our pilot study, and you'll note that the intervention groups are shown in the blue circles and the control group in the red X's. You can see very high and similar levels of food insecurity at both groups at baseline. By 6 months, we already saw statistically significant improvements in food insecurity in the intervention compared to the control group, which persisted throughout the rest of the trial. In terms of HIV clinical outcomes, you could see that a higher proportion were actually virologically suppressed in the control group compared to the intervention group at baseline, really attesting to the need for the larger randomized control trial. However, by 6 months, these trends reversed, and by 12 months, you could see that these statistically significant improvements in viral suppression persisted, and this was the first trial, to our knowledge, to look at impacts of a livelihood intervention on HIV clinical indicators. We saw very similar and parallel statistically significant improvements in CD4 cell counts in the intervention compared to the control group. And as a measure of empowerment, we also saw statistically significant improvements in self-confidence. So looking specifically at the mechanisms, our qualitative work did attest to the nutritional, mental health, and behavioral mechanisms through which this intervention improved health. And I'll just read you 2 quotes here. So along the mental health pathway, a participant says, "It has given me hope and will to do my things, not like before when I used to be hopeless and scared. I also have the will to go about my duties and farm, from which I get food and money, thus living like any other person." And along the behavioral pathway, a participant said, "I find getting to the clinic to be a little easier because now I'm able to get money for my fare to the clinic. I get money from the farm produce." So what about empowerment? So both men and women described improvements in empowerment, and this was particularly in the context of women's decision-making autonomy as well as sexual autonomy. And here's a quote from a male participant. "Since I joined Shamba Maisha, we all have an equal say when it comes to our property. Everyone has an equal share in the resources. My 2 wives and I have to give their opinion before we see which opinion to adopt. The chair of our meetings is not necessarily me, it can be any of the 3 of us." And as a result of improvements in empowerment, as well as decreases in household stress, participants also described reductions in violence. And here's a quote from a male. "I used to be violent. The violence would mostly relate to money issues, and this is the root cause in many homes. But right now she manages the farm and takes it as hers. Now she has some few coins in the pocket, and if I need some money, I can always ask her. So it is taking care of some form of domestic violence to a very big extent." And there were other wide-ranging impacts. For instance, participants described changes in HIV stigma not only amongst themselves, but also among community members, in part because they were more productive and also looked healthier. "Since I joined Shamba Maisha, I've experienced a big change, and now I have a name. Nowadays, when I hear anyone who wants to purchase vegetables, I just urge them to come to my home and they will get them. They now view us as people. And in case of any problem and the village committees asks for contributions, I make mine immediately. This makes them realize that I am powerful and that I am also a human being." So to the point about this intervention having multiple impacts beyond HIV, Lisa Butler led a parallel R21 study to look at the impact of this household-level intervention on HIV-affected children, looking at growth and development. And the primary growth for the pediatric study were measures of somatic growth and diet and nutritional diversity. And hot off the presses, they found that compared to children in control households, kids in the intervention households had greater increases in their weight and in consumption of staples, legumes, fruits and vegetables, meat and fat. And we're now in the 4th year of our larger cluster randomized trial in 16 communities across 3 counties in Kenya, looking at the impact of the intervention on the health outcomes I've already mentioned and on the pathways I've already mentioned. We're also looking at the cost effectiveness of the intervention and the best way to scale up the intervention. And the Butler study is looking at the impact of Shamba Maisha nutritional health and neurobehavioral outcomes among HIV-affected children. The pathways they're looking at are child diet, caregiver physical and mental health, caregiver empowerment, and the home environment, and also looking at the incremental cost and cost effectiveness of the intervention with respect to these outcomes. So we were recently funded on a study to look at the impact of this intervention on the sexual and reproductive health of HIV-affected adolescent females in the households, and Tor and Margarita here are co-investigators on this. And the pathways that we're looking at include both caregiver pathways of improved health and parenting, as well as adolescent-specific pathways of improved mental health, educational attainment, and empowerment. And the goal here of this particular grant will be to translate the lessons learned into the design of an enhanced intervention that's most responsive to the needs of HIV-affected adolescent girls. And we believe this intervention may impact other outcomes. For instance, we have a Doris Duke Fellow now looking at the impacts using mixed methods on pregnancy and reproductive health among the adults. We believe this can impact other chronic disease targets and infectious disease outcomes, although we're not currently looking at this. And we even have a GI fellow interested in creating a project looking at changes in gut and soil microbiome. So let me just talk about some of our lessons learned and implementation, particularly when you're looking at livelihood interventions. You really do need transdisciplinary collaboration, moving beyond your comfort zone of working with the health sector and social scientists and epidemiologists and bringing in other partners like agriculturalists, bankers, and economists. We found that it is critical to have all parties consistently involved throughout, because we've noted that changes in one aspect of the intervention, like the banking, for instance, certainly can impact the other components of the intervention. We found it very useful to use mixed methods, both as a process evaluation to understand the mechanisms by which the interventions worked and the many challenges that we've encountered that I'll get to momentarily, and to involve key stakeholders at all stages, both to promote sustainability and local investment. So we have had a tremendous number of challenges, and so we really did need to be prepared for the unexpected. I think when you're doing livelihood interventions, a lot of things come at you. So first of all, there were changes in banking regulations right at the beginning of the study that affected the financial aspect of the intervention. We had both historically unprecedented floods in the region, as well as historically unprecedented drought, which ended up drying up permanent water sources, and both of these affected the farming aspects of the intervention. Election violence, which I know affected many of the studies in the region, as well as nursing strikes. And there were also the hippos. So when things got wetter, there were more hippos, and the hippos went to, and were starting to eat all of our participants' crops. So when I went to medical school, I never imagined that I would be spending a day in Suba with hippo training for our participants. And how did we address these challenges? So for the changes in banking regulations, we got a lot of involvement from a great UCSF legal team to how to redraft our contracts with the banks. For the historically atypical floods and drought, we convinced our banking partners to honor a sort of insurance package on the loans, so we were able to distribute some seeds to mitigate the negative impacts. And we also had to tailor our training somewhat. For the election violence and the nursing strikes, as many of you have had to, we had to pause data collection. And for the hippos, it just turned out that the Kenyan Wildlife Society offers free training on how to make trenches to prevent hippos from accessing the crops, so we helped arrange those trainings for our participants. And in the last moment, I can't be talking about implementation in a livelihood intervention without bringing up the role of climate change, because climate change has enormous potential to impact livelihoods. So when you have more drought, you see large-scale crop loss, heavy rains could erode soils, wash away crops, and also have killed, so you actually ended up killing some of our participants' animals. Melting glaciers and changing rivers reduce water available for irrigation and home use, and some of the permanent water sources had dried up for the first time during this trial. And then you also see in the setting of climate change thriving plant and pest diseases and animal deaths. And so as a result of this, one of our colleagues, Tammy Nicastro, got funding on a RAP mechanism to look at the impacts of climate change on HIV health and how our intervention may or may not mitigate that. And a key point I want to make here is that climate change is having enormous impacts on livelihood, nutrition, and health. And I'll just read you two quotes here. At the bottom quote, "Weather changes affect yields on my farm. Too much rain or drought interfere with the growth of plants and lowers the quality of yields. This interferes with our children's growth since they are forced to eat food that are difficult to chew." And in terms of other health impacts, I'm reading the bottom quote, "Even though we rarely face chronic diseases, malaria and flu were common during this recent rainy season. Malaria is more common now due to stagnant pools of water that breed mosquitoes during rains." So in summary, we've seen that livelihood interventions can impact multiple health problems simultaneously and for multiple household members, that this type of work really does require transdisciplinary partnership. We need to be thinking about a horizontal rather than a vertical approach, and we hope that the funding mechanisms will catch up with this. And I urge you to consider environmentally sustainable approaches. And I'll just end with my acknowledgements, and thank you very much.